Welcome to the Media Cat Magazine podcast. I'm your host, Mike Piggott, opinions editor at the magazine. And for today's pod, I've got two guests with me, Dan Calladine, head of media futures at Dentsu, and Grace Letley, head of strategy UK at iProspect. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you very much.
Hello.
Hello. Today we're talking about a Dentsu report, The Year of Impact, 2025 Media Trends. As I understand it, this is the 15th year that this report's been done. I just wondered, so as a sort of top line generally, anything in this particular report or this particular year that surprised both of you before we dig into sort of section? We'll do a whistle stop tour of section by section if we can, but I thought as a to kick things off, anything this year you think sort of stood out or surprised you?
I suppose it wasn't really a surprise, but the speed that AI is moving at within the industry was quite surprising when we started talking to people around the network about all the things that they were doing, and when we started looking at examples and things as well. But then I think the other thing that sort of surprised me, but again, probably shouldn't have been a surprise, was simply that while things change, they also seem to stay the same in a way. And one example of this is the evolution of CTV, connected TV, where one of the things that we write about is, well, two things really. One is that a lot of them are getting into buying up sports rights and things. And the second is that the ad tiers are growing really quickly on lots of them. So essentially, connected TV is kind of new, but it's also turning into old TV. It's basically turning into, the TV of 20 years ago with live sport and lots of adverts and things like that as well.
From my perspective, what I always love about Dan's reports is that they are surprisingly accurate for trends over the years. So you have that future facing, you have the innovation lens, but what we see in this report are themes that are really fundamental to our craft, that, whether it is stories expanded, the power of telling stories and bringing consumers and brands closer together through storytelling with new lenses and ways of doing that. Micro moments, like what are the specific moments in which we can best engage and capture the attention of our audience, and then the new lilt on planning in the algorithmic era, but essentially looking at media and creative working closer together again, which is always a really positive thing in my book. So I think it's that meld of loads of really new, exciting innovation, but linked back to core themes of what our craft is really about and what drives growth in this industry.
Yeah, I think you touched on it. Algorithmic era, I think, was one of the bits that jumped out at me in the foreword. And then I think the sort of the rapid evolution of the media landscape. Although, as Dan was saying, it's like some things seem to change a lot, while some things kind of stay the same. Which probably, I guess, sums up humans and technology half the time. I guess the report's divided into four sections, which you sort of touched on. So we've got AI and impact, stories expanded, the quest for quality, and unevenly distributed. So I thought we could sort of zoom through each section, and obviously people can read the report in more depth at their leisure. So really the first section we got is AI and actual impact, I believe it's called. So what's sort of involved in this section is our lives are powered by AI now, it seems. I'm seeing AI absolutely everywhere in everything. How did you guys approach this section?
Yes, so we've got three specific trends within this section. The first one is really all about how the uptake is absolutely massive. In previous reports, we've talked about things like virtual reality, we've talked about things like the metaverse, we've talked about things like blockchain. But compared to those, AI is just, the usage levels are just extraordinary. I mean, I think OpenAI said recently that they now have something like 200 million active users, but then also beyond sort of specific chat boxes like OpenAI and Gemini and things like that, you've got it being integrated into the back end of lots of technologies. So lots of the ways that we do our online shopping, lots of the recommendation engines within things like Spotify, within things like Netflix, essentially have AI at the heart of them now. And even things like some things are starting to feel almost like science fiction. So Reddit recently announced that they were working on a plan to essentially allow you to translate the entire site just at the press of a button. So they've got this, I think, in French so far, but what they're aiming for is essentially 30 languages by the end of next year, which obviously massively expands the accessibility of the site and will do wonders for their user levels. So there's lots of things being built into the back end of technologies for humans. But then also we go on to look at how it's having a really deep impact on our industry. And then some specifics like, sort of really intense personalization through things like business messaging.
Yeah, I think I saw a story about Reddit. Is their first year or first quarter ever in 19 years of profitability due to that translation into different languages, I believe.
I think so. Well, but also beyond that, I think it's just growing in popularity. Ofcom had a report out last week that said that Reddit was now the 5th most popular social site in the UK. So it has overtaken X essentially. And obviously that's only one data source, but you would imagine that it is growing quickly as more people find it more usable.
Yeah. I think we did a small piece on that in the magazine recently, actually. One of the areas, I think you were talking about AI-powered media solutions for platforms. When I was reading through this section, it seemed sort of quite technical to me, but what's the sort of way into that area, would you say? Or what are you expecting to see in the year ahead in that space?
I think from media, there's obviously so many different directions this can go in, varies hugely by platform. I think the thing for brands, for marketers, for agencies, always to keep in mind is to start off with that. What is the problem that we're trying to solve? What is the goal here? And then looking at all the new options and opportunities that are coming up in the alphas and the betas and the new products through media partners through that lens. And then the thing to do from there is experiment. We have a huge culture of experimentation at iProspect, and when the landscape is changing so rapidly, it really is the only way to get a thorough understanding of what the opportunities are for your business in a practical sense with any new technology. And so that willingness to test and learn off the back of a clear hypothesis is really critical to navigate this changing landscape. But to take one example, we work with a publisher in the subscription business. So driving subscriptions is absolutely that sole focus. And Meta has recently launched their Advantage Plus shopping campaigns, which are essentially machine learning powered tool that enables campaigns to be more rapidly optimized towards finding new customers and driving those conversions. So the team created a test around that. There was a hypothesis that could help drive subscriptions faster. However, these machine learnings, it's constantly resetting the learnings, and versus like a dynamic ad situation where you're building on those learnings time and time again. There was a thought that perhaps actually the dynamic ads could be win out on effectiveness because of that incremental set of learnings. However, the automation really did transform and step change the subscription rates that they saw increasing by 76%. Decreasing the CPA by 76% and increasing engagement rates by 48%. And what was really interesting coming out of that is that, yes, the automation has enabled you to save time in the kind of the manual labor of ad building. It's also increased the speed at which new content could be served to consumers. But through that, it was actually the finding, it was the speed of freshness of content that was the biggest driver of performance, not that kind of slow incremental bank of building on learning. So content freshness, I think, is something that consumers have a real hunger for, and a theme that I think we see throughout this trend deck. But that's a great way to test, learn, and then increase your efficacy through taking on a new product that's out there driven by automation.
Yeah, freshness sounds good, definitely. I mean, I guess if the opposite is stale, then you definitely want to go the fresh route. I think it's that whole thing of humans and discovery, isn't it? Like constantly looking for new things, which I guess we'll explore probably in the next section with stories, right? I imagine.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't think it's really sort of freshness versus stale, because the speed is already fairly quick, but I guess when it comes to manually updating things versus automation, automation will win on speed every time.
I do have this wonder where it was about 10 years ago when it was like, oh, CMOs and marketing directors are going to have to like tackle big data. And it was this, every conversation was about big data. And it kind of feels like that's almost small fry now compared to trying to get their heads around, AI and sort of how to manage that. But like, I think you were saying like just constantly testing and learning seems to be the best way forward.
Yeah, testing and learning with a clear hypothesis and what you're trying to achieve, and always linking that back. Not getting distracted by the kind of the shiny and new for the sake of it, but having that really clear set hypothesis, and it lowers the barrier to entry as well, because you don't necessarily have to go in wholesale. You can test on a relatively low budget, relatively low level of resource, before taking that bigger plunge, and you're building your evidence base in which to take to the business for increased investment into new spaces.
And one of the other parts of the sort of before we wrap up the sort of AI section, at least for now, was talking around sort of micro moments, and I guess messaging and chat support and things like that. Is that sort of constantly kind of just filling in the little gaps and staying in touch with the consumer at kind of every stage, or when they have little queries, and building stronger connections, I suppose?
I think what we really mean by it is it's almost like extreme personalization or greater personalization than's really been possible before, and that could be sort of anything from slightly personalizing the ads based on somebody's proximate location or something like that. But then also we go on to talk about business messaging in the section, which is something that we've been working on with Meta, where essentially we're doing some trials at the moment where somebody could respond to an ad by saying they want to get in touch, and then it would take them to a WhatsApp chat or a Facebook Messenger chat, and then they'd have a conversation with a brand, asking about availability of something in store or something. And this essentially opens up the commerce opportunity much more quickly within the marketing process. So previously, you show somebody an ad and they might be interested in it, they might want to buy something immediately, but this actually allows you to for them to ask a question and sort of get deeper into the process. But then you can bring up the opportunity of, would you like to book something? Would you like to buy something? We have this many in store near to you. We have these different colors and things. And we're doing quite a lot of testing with this at the moment. We're testing, for example, next year in Q1 with scenic cruises. And you could imagine how it would work for them with people asking about availability and, sailing times and those sorts of things.
Yeah. I think that it sounds like there's lots of little gaps that can be filled in the sort of, I guess, the customer experience. One of the next section, I suppose, to continue is stories expanded. So I was wondering if you could give an overview of what this section covers.
Yeah, so this is really talking about why storytelling is now even more important than it was before, because as we move into what we think of as the algorithmic era, where many of the media choices that we're presented with are driven by algorithms. I was talking earlier on about Netflix and Spotify and recommendations and things like that. What it means is, while it becomes a very engaging experience for all of us, because we're presented with a lot of things that we like, that we're interested in, that we find useful, what it can mean is that it's quite hard for brands to cut through if somebody hasn't already expressed an interest in the brand or expressed an interest in that topic. So effectively, it's kind of like the concept of how do you break into the filter bubbles. And we think one way to do this is through fantastic storytelling, because essentially these are stories that people will share with their friends, or they will essentially enter into the culture. And we've seen, there's quite a lot of news stories like this that go viral is, I suppose, a sort of element of this. But what we're saying basically is there's lots of ways that you can really up your storytelling to make sure that you break through to the audiences that you're trying to reach. For example, one of these is working closer with the creator economy. So the sorts of influencers, whatever platform they're on, whether they be on TikTok or Instagram or even Substack or podcast platforms, because essentially they're master storytellers within this medium. And if you can get them talking about your brand, then they'll do it with a real authenticity.
Yeah, I think Well, I know over the sort of years of the magazine, we focused quite a lot on kind of getting closer to communities and things like that. And I think, yeah, definitely you touched on it already, but one of the first areas in this section, I think you call is power in niches and, brands finding their way into communities and blogs and forums.
What we're meaning in the report is essentially that more and more, if you search for something which is actually a question, what you get is Reddit appears in the top 10 organic links, because Google acknowledges that Reddit is a very good place for finding out, unbiased answers to questions, essentially.
And just building on that point that Dan made before, and your question, I think this question of how do we break into the filter bubbles is just such an important thing for planners and practitioners to have in mind. How do you cut through when algorithms are driving and optimizing so much of the experience in huge platforms that are occupying massive amounts of consumers' times? And that communities are a really rich source of insight and a wonderful route into spaces where brands can really genuinely add value to consumers and to those communities. We see those take shape in so many different forms. Social is the first you think of, and working with creators, as Dan has spoken to, but also in the audio space through podcasts. Reddit as well is a really rich source, and we've seen some campaigns leverage this in a wonderful way. One of our clients is IKEA, and it's this algorithmic era can be really challenging for clients that need to reach the many people, such broad audiences, but actually thinking about the different communities where you can build that rich relevance can really pay dividends. They recently done a campaign to promote their mattresses and promote the brilliant sleep that you can have with an IKEA mattress. And the team have identified the insight that often actually media is the barrier between us and sleep. It is the doom scrolling. It is let's watch one more episode on Netflix. And also people are using media to try and to get past this. People are using podcasts to try and get to sleep. So using that insight, that the team have actually created lots of wonderful host mini reads in the podcast space, a series of branded content like the podcast that nobody finished, because it's Jessie Ware doing her table manners podcast and reading out in a very slow, soporific voice every vegetable that she's ever come across, and a series of different podcast reads like this that designed to help people get to sleep. And I think that sense of sort of surprise and delight that you referenced earlier, Mike, is really important for consumers to help try and break through and gain that attention. And you don't really expect a brand to be trying to help you to get to sleep or to turn over the channel from ITV and go and have a look at some IKEA mattresses instead and get a good night's sleep in. So it's a really lovely route in, and the team actually work with Reddit as well, recognizing that there's loads of really interesting kind of conversations going on around sleep challenges, because sleep is genuinely a challenge for such a modern day affliction, not being able to sleep when we have so much stimulation and overstimulation. So there are actually a series of Reddit communities, night owls, the overachievers, and they were able to tap into those and have meaningful conversations with those groups about sleep challenges and place IKEA mattresses at the heart of that, which I think is just a lovely execution of recognizing that, these age-old insights are still such an important part of how we then leverage the new landscape to connect with consumers.
That sounds it kind of almost sounds like it fits in the sort of the rise of more like wellness and self-care type things that kind of brands have been leaning into in probably the last 5 years or so, with the sleep. I feel like I need to go and have rest now and have a little lie down. One of the other areas in this section, I think, is around connected TV. I think it's called Connected TV Gets Scale. There's a mention of sort of live sport on streaming, and I've kind of come across, a lot more sort of connections to live sport in terms of opportunities for brands in recent times. And it put me in mind of Netflix's the Jake Paul Mike Tyson fight that's their first foray into streaming live sport. Is that what are we likely to see a lot more of that sort of stuff and those kind of kind of things going forward? Would you guys say?
I think in terms of the live sport, yes, we're going to see a lot. There's lots of stories around, particularly Amazon buying up more rights. I think they realize that, well, I mean, you can sort of see the psychology behind it in that if you're really into a particular show, like with Apple TV, I really, really like Slow Horses, and I can take out a subscription for 1 month and essentially watch all of Slow Horses. But if I'm a big football fan and I want to watch an entire season, obviously I can't binge the entire physical sports season within a month. So one of the reasons is that it sort of builds longevity of subscription, but then also it sort of builds passion. People are discussing it on social media, online water coolers, and those sorts of things, and it sort of builds much more of a sense of community for the particular platform when you're doing it. So I think that's so I think we're going to see this continue, but also I think in practical terms, the streamers have pretty deep pockets compared to the national broadcasters in many respects. So I think maybe we're going to see more of this as time goes on.
Obviously, yeah, sport is probably a thing we could probably talk about for hours in terms of the different things going on platforms, etc. But we must move on. So I wanted to quickly touch on another part of this section called algorithm planning, where I think here you mentioned that automation will propel media planning and sort of maybe getting media and creative to work a lot closer together. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So essentially, this is really all about how algorithms are not only driving the content that we see when we look at a lot of these digital channels, but they're also driving the advertising. So I suppose as a sort of quite simple example or analogy, if I look at Instagram knows the sorts of things I'm interested in because I've been there for more than 10 years, liking and following like crazy. And so it knows the sort of content to show me, but it also, by extension, knows the sorts of ads to show me because it knows the sorts of things I'm likely to engage with. So even if I'm outside a sort of traditional target audience for a particular brand trying to sell something, if it sort of fits that interest that I have, then Instagram is likely to show that to me. And so as the platforms get more algorithmic, what we're trying to do is understand how this works and how we can actually take advantage of this, but then also what sort of data sources we've got to build our own algorithms to make sure that we're reaching the right sorts of people, whether it be our data or the client's own data. But another element of it is, and again, to sort of use the relatively straightforward analogy of Instagram, I think because so many people use it, so many people understand it. If I put a picture up on Instagram and it's not a very good picture, it'll still get a few likes because, my friends are nice people and stuff. But if I put up a really good picture or a picture of a life moment or something, it'll get far more likes. And because it's got more likes, then the algorithm will say, okay, this is a better picture than usual. Let's show this to all of Dan's friends. And then if it keeps getting likes, they'll say, and let's show this to people who don't actually know Dan. And so likewise with the advertising, if your advertising is creatively very good, then it will essentially get a higher quality score within the algorithm and it will automatically get shown to more people. So essentially, we think there are some new ways of working with the platforms, some new ways of thinking about how you communicate using advertising. And a lot of this involves essentially a greater integration of the creative and media together.
Sounds like a good way to move going forward, I would say, rather than them trying to work sort of at odds or slightly apart, maybe.
So I think so, yeah. And I think also, obviously, different sorts of content works better on different sorts of platforms. And so again, the new thinking around it is really trying to understand what works, how it works, what is likely to work here, but not likely to work here, and so on. Sorry, Grace, I think I interrupted you.
Yeah, no, that's such an important point, though, you just raised about the having creative that is optimized to each of the different platforms, and there are so many platforms now, is absolutely critical for that user experience to be a positive one and to get the most out of that media placement, because as you've outlined, like the content is such an important driver within the algorithmic setup of getting that right content is critical. And there's ways in which I think we either, when we're planning, we're either planning to think, how can we go above and beyond what an algorithmic response would deliver in these social platforms? How can we think in the round about multiple different channels, different ways in, those really smart, insightful campaigns that take a different approach to kind of cut through and deliver that surprise and delight for the consumers? But we absolutely also have to be thinking, well, within the algorithmic landscape, so much of the landscape is driven by algorithms now. How can we optimize to make sure that we're getting the best showing in that space? And there's some tools and things that we've developed at dentsu that help do that and help get ahead of the game. So we've got one called AI Neuro that essentially can uses AI to assess creative and benchmarks it on its visuals, on its ability to garner attention, and in best practice sort of principles, and comes out with a creative quality score. And it can deliver that for clients before they've even spent a penny of media money supporting it. So, and then it has a list of recommendations, and kind of you can course correct on the creative and the content before it actually goes out there into the real world, where you can then continue to optimize further. But it can save you sort of around 10%, a little bit less, a little bit more on that media saving of having optimized the creative in advance. And all these small incremental gains in this vast algorithmic space can make a massive difference. But we mustn't ever just get trapped in the sort of the nuances of that incrementality. It's really important. It can make a huge difference to how far your marketing budget goes, but we always have to be looking at the bigger picture and what are the step changes that we can make to get clients ahead and in a different space that's not going to be that kind of sea of sameness that is so often thrown at the sort of the algorithmic era.
Well, actually, that's probably a good point to sort of segue into the next section, which is called the quest for quality. So in this section here, I think the first area talks about retail shaping media, and I think you guys mentioned Amazon and Walmart here, and I think something to do with Disney and Mercado in terms of boosting shopper capabilities. Can you go through this section or give us an overview?
Yeah, sure. So very quickly, this is really just about the rise of retail media. And I think when you're looking at a trend report with 10 trends in it, then there's a few that almost automatically pick themselves. And I think this year, retail media is definitely one of those, and as in fact, CTV as well, because it's just growing so quickly. We recently had another report out, our ad spend report. And in that one, we saw that according to data from our colleagues in the States, retail media is growing by something like 30% a year in the developed markets. And so, it's growing so quickly, and it's not just Amazon, it's also people like Walmart, it's, people like Tesco and Boots over here, but also people like Uber and Deliveroo, essentially taking first-party data from their signed-in users and using that to give really good, valuable data for targeting advertising. And we're also seeing more and more sort of, I suppose, convergence where you're getting shoppable opportunities within media. So we're seeing more and more examples of, sort of things like shoppable TV and shoppable gaming and things like that as well.
I think one of the next areas is around supply chains, where I think you talk about sort of attention metrics used for media buying. Can you sort of dig into that a little bit, please?
Yes, so we work with a number of companies, including Lumen, who are able to measure attention using things like eye tracking, but not entirely eye tracking, because we've also done this with audio as well, where we've been measuring the attention of audio advertising within podcasts and within streaming and things. So essentially what this does is it takes a step beyond the idea of the impression. So was the advertising served, or the idea of viewability? So was it in screen when the person was on the page and things like that, and just taking it to another level, looking to see whether it actually got attention, which is ultimately what we're trying to do as advertising professionals. And
I suppose one of the final bits in this section I wanted to touch on was brand safety issues, which get mentioned. Is this being a sort of, seems like it's more increasingly challenging thing for advertisers? I mean, whenever we run any pieces on brand safety, it seemed to get quite a lot of reads and views, etc. Seems like people want to know more and more about how to tackle brand safety.
Yes, and again, I mean, I suppose the point is there's so many user-generated channels, but also there are so many. I mean, one of the things AI does is it makes it much easier to create content, and as a result of this, we've seen, or partly as a result of this, we've seen the emergence of what we call MFAs, made for advertising channels, and these might look like bona fide news sources, but actually they're not really. The content isn't particularly engaging. So by measuring things like engagement, by measuring things like quality, you can actually make sure that the advertising appears within really high quality content. And we're doing a number of things as an agency to make the most of the technology to ensure that this happens as much as is possible. And again, this is something which clients are after, because when they look at the effectiveness of their advertising and they measure things like effectiveness, or they measure things like the carbon footprint of their campaign, when we see good results, it almost always comes down to the fact that what we're buying is just much higher quality media. So the high quality journalism, the really high quality content within streaming platforms and things like that as well.
Finally, the final section that we have in the report is unevenly distributed. Can you give us a bit of an overview of that section? Because I mean, when I was reading it, I was like, I felt like uneven tech would be a good thing, but maybe we can sort of get into that.
Well, I suppose so. So this is the thing that ends the deck, and it's almost like a lot of the other trends are very much this is happening now, and you need to be aware of this if you're not already, or you need to be doing this more in 2025 than you are now. This is one that really looks into 2025, but also potentially the next 5 years or so, or maybe potentially beyond. And it really just makes the point that we've been in a world where media and technology has felt incredibly flat across different countries, across different audience groups and things, in that more than 50% of people now own a smartphone globally. And on these smartphones, there's an awful lot of apps like WhatsApp and Instagram and TikTok and so on, which are essentially designed to work on relatively basic devices. So there's, many of these things are used by over 1 billion people, over 2 billion people in some cases. So you could be in Manchester, you could be in Mumbai, essentially having a pretty similar media experience. But what we're now seeing, and what we're going to see increasingly as time goes on, is this sort of unevenness creeping in again. And there's really 3 reasons for this. The first one is about how a lot of governments are getting very restrictive over the technology that they're allowing, particularly in places, things like the European Union with AI. So one example of this, we have the Google AI overviews, which are the ones that if you do a Google search, it just sort of essentially produces you a definitive answer from AI, essentially, with sources. We had this a few months after they had it in the States, but they haven't got it in Europe, and I think they won't be getting it in Europe for quite some time, because there is more concern in Europe over how the AI works and those sorts of things. The second reason is the quality of the device and newness of the device is going to start mattering a lot more. So Apple has Apple Intelligence, but it only works on the latest Apple devices, because a lot of the AI is done locally on the device itself. And so something you can do on a device which you bought last week, on a new iPhone that you bought last week, simply won't work on an iPhone that you bought 2 years ago. So again, there's this sort of inequality, this sort of unevenness creeping in. Then the third reason is simply more and more things need to be paid for than before. So obviously the creeping rise of things like paywalls, and they're even now getting applied to things that were routinely free before. So things like podcasts. New York Times, for example, recently put a lot of its podcasts behind a paywall. So there's this sort of growing unevenness, growing potential inequality creeping into the media space that we've taken for granted over the last few years as sort of a sort of commonality, basically, a sort of flatness of media and technology.
Yeah, I think one of the issues definitely that jumped out to me was the haves and have-nots and the paywalls, etc. I think I don't know if you touched on here sort of how advertisers might be able to help in this space with sort of access to news and things.
Yeah, so I think there's potentially a few things that advertisers can do, and this potentially could be things like brand funded content, but also I think it could be things like advertisers taking things outside a paywall or bundling something into your subscription or something like that. So essentially, and this all relates to long running issues of the cost of living, which have really, you could argue they've been around for an awful long time, but they've become exacerbated really by the inflation in things like food prices that we've seen since the pandemic. So we think there's potentially quite a lot of scope for advertisers, if they understand what is going on, if they understand their audiences, essentially to be essentially to be trying to offer things to their customers, to their followers, to their fans.
Yeah, I mean definitely that sounds like a potentially good area for them to get into, especially if, as you say, things start to become potentially more uneven. I mean, we've pretty much got to wrap up there. I know it was a whistle-stop tour of the report. There's obviously a lot more detail in there, but I was wondering if there's any sort of final thoughts or sort of readers and media industry people from both of you regarding the report. Anything you'd like to sort of sum up or finish off mentioning?
I think from my point of view, one of the quotes that I really loved from Dan's report was that 81% of consumers declare the best way for brands to stand out and earn their loyalty is to surprise and delight them in unexpected ways. And I just think, if you read this report through that lens, you see so many areas of opportunity to deliver that for consumers. And of course, consumers aren't sort of sitting around looking out for brands, waiting for them to surprise and delight them. The point is that consumers are bombarded with so much information, and actually this need to surprise and delight is a necessity for us to be capturing their attention and making credible and relevant contact with them. So I think that's a great lens to be looking at this report through, and please do dive in and give it a read, because it's fascinating.
Dan, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think just to say, we hope you like the report. It's very much a team effort. So you've talked about it being my report a couple of times, but
sorry about that.
I get in trouble for that, but it's very, very much a team effort. We spoke to, multiple people all around the network, all around the different media brands and the different companies that we have within dentsu, really trying to make sure that what we were saying made sense and had the best examples and things like that. So we do hope that you really enjoy it, and we hope that it really helps to set you up for a really productive 2025.
Good stuff. And perhaps we'll just sort of do a caveat there of me just sort of saying, whenever I say your report, I mean you as a spokesperson, perhaps, or the head or the face or something. I
think I've been guilty of that too. So
no problem at all. No problem at all. Thank you.
Good stuff. Well, thank you so much to both of you for coming on the Media Cat Magazine podcast.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.